see. I was going to ask, so, and how long have you and your husband been married or together or whatever?
For 7 years now.
Okay. And then I'm just curious because, I write fiction and nonfiction, and some of my nonfiction is sort of memoir-y type stuff. So I always assume everybody's ready to talk about their lives, and that's probably the wrong assumption. But what, because, what is your background? I'm just curious because the book didn't have anything really about you in it, and I except the stuff on the dust jacket.
Yeah, I've written plenty of sort of more personal work
Yeah,
than this one. So I feel like maybe if someone's read more than one of my books, maybe they're tired of hearing me
yeah,
yap on about myself. But no, I'm from a small town in Kansas. I've
yeah,
been a writer for 20 years or so.
yeah.
So I've kind of moved around a lot, lived all over, done a lot of different kinds of jobs.
Yeah, well, let me introduce you properly, and then I'm going to ask you all kinds of questions about yourself, and of course, we're going to get into the book. Um, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast interview series, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today, I'm talking to Jessa Crispin. I'm reading her name not off my notes section, but off her book, which we will be talking about. And I'm just telling her how much I like it, and now it's going to cost me a fortune because I'll have to buy everything else she's written and read it. Um, and Jessa is a writer, and let me read my notes here, author and feminist. She is the editor-in-chief of the publication The Culture We Deserve and the author of many books, including My Three Dads, The Dead Ladies Project, and What is Wrong with Men. And the subtitle of this book, of course, is what's going to sell it, and that is Patriarchy, the Crisis of Masculinity, and how, of course, Michael Douglas films explain everything. So brilliant, brilliant subtitle. And I'm going to ask you how this all came into being, and also if you had any contact with Mike Douglas while you were doing this.
No, no. I left him alone as much as I possibly could. Yeah, essentially, it was the pandemic. I
Yeah,
didn't have anywhere to go.
yeah,
And so I was watching a lot of Michael Douglas movies,
yeah,
probably starting obsessively with Basic Instinct
yeah,
because that's been one of my, Verhoeven's one of my favorite directors. It's one of my favorite movies.
yeah,
And I just got deeply stuck in it for a bit. And, as all of this was happening during the pandemic, there was all of this discourse
sure.
in the media, in social media about toxic masculinity, the sort of height of Me Too. And I just found that conversation that was happening so limited
Yeah,
and so frustrating.
yeah.
And so basically, instead of being a form of escape, the Michael Douglas movies became a different way of thinking about some of these
Yeah,
subject
yeah,
matters because he embodies that so well, the
yeah, he
toxic
does.
masculinity.
So I'm going to introduce you properly as I just sort of did here, in a kind of a half-hearted way. But the first thing I want to say is, first of all, I just want to be upfront with everybody, and that is what is wrong with men, patriarchy, and the crisis of masculinity, and how, of course, Michael Douglas films explain everything is, uh, just speaking very personally here, if Jessa wrote a book that Frank Schaeffer would love, this is it. Because as a failed Hollywood movie director that made four features back in the 80s, and then someone who's written quite successfully since, a good bit of my life has prepared me to not only understand Mike Douglas's films, but um, I grew up in an evangelical setting on the far right, changed my mind and left that background. And so the kind of cultural arc, although it's a very different one than the one you describe, is one that I understand very closely from the inside. So first of all, I'm a male, I'm married, I'm a father and grandfather. Um, I'm very interested in Mike Douglas films. I happen to know them backwards. I've always been a fan of the same movies that you're covering here. I know them all very well. So I'm perfectly prepared to read your book. I want to open this by reading a passage which is, I forget where it is here. page 169, and I'm going to just read it. I think it's a good introduction to your book. Grievance culture in America is overwhelmingly associated these days with Donald Trump, and both Trump and grievance are often associated with the white rural poor, but it often looks a lot more like Mike Douglas. When you consider the demographic breakdown of who voted for Donald Trump and participated in the January 6th insurrection, it wasn't the poor. The demographic voted for Trump, consistent with the numbers it had voted Republican for decades. One of the broadest bases of new support for Trump, clinching his election, came from the semi-professional, the disappointed, the middling, the people for whom things worked out okay, but not to their full expectation. They were entrepreneurs who didn't have the regional dominance they had dreamed of, the middle managers and the third best salesperson this quarter, the students who didn't quite get into the university that was their first choice. These leaders of grievance all say the same things. The world was great when it treasured and rewarded men. Now that it doesn't, at least not the same way, there is something wrong about it. We must return to its natural state. So now that's way into your book. But when I read that passage, I thought, if I was your publisher, it would be on the back cover because it sort of makes it very contemporary, which your book is not about Donald Trump. That's not the point of the book. But I think in the present climate, when you can't do anything without looking at his picture, and
Mm.
it's a total intrusion of this person into everybody's life, whether you want it or not. I decided to let him intrude into this conversation because, of course, you couldn't have known this at the time, but the context in which your book is being published is a context which no publicist could dream up because everything you're talking about is happening in real time, ripped from the headlines as we speak. Every prophetic gasp of a Mike Douglas movie, falling down, all of it, it's all happening again and again and again. I think you actually talk about Groundhog Day in the book. You mention
Mm.
it, and it really is that experience. So when I saw the title of your book someplace, I forget, this was before I know we had booked you, I was immediately interested in it because I thought, why hasn't someone else thought of this? Because Mike Douglas's movies are the perfect vehicle, weirdly so. You'd really like to have a conversation with him and say, how did you choose all these scripts? Because it's almost 100%. It's
Hmm.
like these are the only sorts of movies he ever made, which is very odd. I don't think there's
Yeah.
another actor like this. Um, and they're all sort of a commentary on contemporary life of that moment. And of course, his arc is my arc because I'm going to be 73 in August. I don't know how old Mike is. Um, and then, of course, there's a subtext to that of his being sort of original Nepo baby and the most successful one who kind of actually probably will be better remembered than his father, Kirk Douglas. But there's so much going on in here, and I just want to show you something. And I'm not, doing this for any reason except I just want to show you. If you look at the dog ears of this book, and then I want to show you one other thing at the beginning. These are just the notes that I've been making of things I want to go back to and reread and quote.
Oh, that's very kind.
And so I am into your book to the point where, it's crazy. You totally hook, line, and sinkered me. So I don't know what kind of an introduction that is, but I just want to thank you for writing the book because I found it instructive and entertaining. And one last thing, and then I promise you, I'm not going to talk much for the rest of this interview. I'll be reading bits and asking you about them. But as part of the setup, um, lastly, for anybody that says, well, all we need, like a hole in the head, is another woman writing a book called What is Wrong with Men? This is, and could a man write a book just called What is Wrong with Women? The movies of whatever. Maybe not because of how publishing works these days. But I want to say that as a man with two sons, one who served in the Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan, and I have grandchildren that I do childcare for and so forth and so on. I've sort of lived big chunks of your story. The weird thing about this book is I think it's the most sympathetic book I've read by a woman to men.
Mm.
You are very fond of men and you are basically going to bat for us. And I want to thank you for that
Oh.
because it's not what you would expect from the cover, but you're using Mike Douglas as a road into saying, the script changed for women after feminism, and they all had these little groups they could huddle in and encourage each other. The guy thing is to be by yourself. And so all these men are lone individuals facing these massive changes. And of course, Mike does this in his movies. So that's a long preamble, but I want to thank you for just an amazing book. This does not fit with anything. It's a unique standalone one-off, and you've really done something here.
Thank you. That's very kind. Um, as far as being sympathetic to men, um, you know, one of the things that I objected to so much in this sort of pandemic era conversation about masculinity, about the crisis in masculinity, was the way that people felt free to put one individual man to stand for all the crimes
Sure.
of masculinity, patriarchy, whatever.
Yeah.
And so when I started writing the book, I thought it would be a mistake to in any way bring up Michael Douglas's private life. Like
Yes.
through the tabloids, through speculation, through gossip, whatever, through interviews, I just thought that that level of not just intrusion, but also spectacle, the way that
Yeah.
we hold individuals up like that now for the
Yeah.
spectacle of tearing them apart, I thought would be such a mistake.
Yeah.
So that's been kind of my um, a thing that I always want to press that this is about Michael Douglas, the character, the archetype, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
clear. And you're using what I love is your respect for art here. You're obviously someone who believes in the intrinsic worth of artistic expression because you treat the films with tremendous respect. And you're not, this is not about Mike Douglas. I mean, this is not a Daily Mail version of Mike Douglas. This is a real serious look at his films. One thing that comes through clearly is that you understand movies and you're a terrific interpreter of them. I haven't read any of your film criticism, but it would be worth reading if you ever did it. Let me just go through and pull some things out here that I really found amazing. You talk about care work is degrading, sensuality is sinful, emotions are irrational. Domestication is the same thing as castration. While the public sphere for women had looked like a prize, the private sphere for men looked like a trap. Now, I've chosen in my notes that I've made here to emphasize what I'll call, uh, for better lack, Jessa Crispin, the philosopher, theologian, social critic, because we know Mike Douglas's films, and while that's the through line in the book, what I'm really interested in is how the movies set up your observations and your conclusions. So as I quote you, I'm going to be talking about that. So let's just start a little bit with that whole thing. Um, let's talk about the plight of men in the 20th century going into the 21st century, charted through Mike Douglas's films and sort of broad strokes, because you talk about the fact that we're supposed to be carers, but at the same time, masculine. When it comes, this is how you're supposed to be. And then, are you part of toxic masculinity? There's been so much thrown at men. And of course, there's other books out now on how boys are not doing well and so forth and so
Mm.
on. So this is very much in the air. But I found your sort of social criticism going through the book, a through line that I found very interesting. So I'm going to throw things out at you on that level rather than about the movies. And so you say the standoff that developed between men and women in the wake of the changing gender roles created a state of heteropessimism that entrenched animosity between the sexes. So let's just start with that. Talk about that aspect of your book. Animosity between the sexes, mutual suspicion.
Yeah, so heteropessimism is this word that sort of emerged. Asa Saracen, who's a feminist thinker, wrote an amazing essay on the subject that kind of sparked this whole this way of thinking about the contemporary setup between the sexes. There's the sort of, classical war between the sexes,
Sure.
always been at odds, et cetera, et cetera. You can see it in Euripides. You can see it all the way through. And yet there is a a specific form of suspicion, hostility, nihilist resignation within heterosexuality today on both
Yeah.
sides, where
Yeah.
everyone is so concerned about being played, right? Or taken for a fool, taken advantage of, discarded, whatever. And so it becomes a kind of space where sincerity is impossible,
Mm.
where intimacy, real intimacy is impossible. And everything is sort of negotiated in this kind of, you know,
Yeah.
bitter divorce court way, even on the first date. So I kind of trace this back to during second wave feminism. You had all these conversations about within the feminist community
Mm.
about the kinds of lives that women wanted to lead and how they could sort of broaden their horizons
Yeah.
romantically, professionally, etc., sexually, that they didn't have to settle for disappointment and sort of feeling stuck
Sure.
in relationships and situations, right? Um, this is sort of backed up legally with the beginning of the no-fault divorce, which
Yeah.
completely transforms marriage in the United
Yeah.
States. And men's culture sort of looks at what's going on, and men's culture is kind of loose, defined as, I guess, like men's magazines, movies, novels, that kind
Sure.
of stuff. Um, looks at all of this happening and sees it with like a kind of fear, but also, again, like hostility
Yeah.
of you're asking for too much. We did not consent to these changes. This is not in
Hmm.
our best interest, and so on. And so it becomes a sort of the withholding of emotion, of generosity, of intimacy from women becomes a
Yeah.
huge part of men's culture.
Yeah.
It becomes about, not how to be a good husband in a changing time. It becomes about Michael Douglas on a motorcycle in a leather jacket,
Yeah.
post-divorce, can't take his kid to school because he's on his motorcycle, it doesn't have a second helmet. And it's that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
and of
it's,
course, in the
yeah.
cultural context in which Mike Douglas is doing these earlier films that you're covering, Johnny Carson's on air every night telling jokes about his third divorce, his latest thing, with men who are sort of laughing it up and talking about hiding their money. There's a general cultural thing going on here that contextualizes what is going on in the Mike Douglas movies you're talking about. But this one of the through line. There's a lot of through lines in your book, and of course, you're following the whole pattern that comes out of divorce and the cynicism, the divorce culture that comes from that. I find that very interesting because I think it's a much bigger deal than people allowed for. We are a very therapeutic culture. We have a lot of people around telling you to feel good about yourself no matter what you've done. But people don't want to deal with the fact that what I guess all the studies bear out, and that is how lost so many people in the subsequent generations became, especially now you get up to Gen Z, and you have to ask, well, how's all this working out for you when people don't date, they're not having sex, people aren't marrying and having children? If you were from another planet examining us as a species, you'd
Mhm.
be comparing us to pandas at this point, saying that they're sort
Yes.
of clueless when it comes to mating and procreation and the rest of it. So, and I want to get into this more specifics of the book, but I was so interested just on a conversational basis to ask you a question. And that is that the kind of overarching themes you cover, whether it's divorce and all these other things, um, if you're a representative of feminism, which you aren't really because you're your own particular kind of person, and I don't want to use generalities, but if you're of your moment, my question to you and then to my generation particularly is, okay, how did all this work out for you? Because in the
For
final
women.
analysis, no, for the human
Oh,
race,
yeah.
if there's this tension between the sexes and we're not procreating and mating, if this was an endangered species somewhere, they'd be trying to repopulate the cliffside with the kind of bird that can't get it to get air anymore. Like, in other words, forget the philosophy and feminism for a minute and all our labels, and even male and female,
Hmm.
and just talk about us as a species in terms of what the overarching theme of your book is, which I would just put down to one line, and that is it hasn't worked out very well.
Well, sure. I mean, once we start talking about it in the sense of like trying to get pandas to have babies, then we get into like the JD Vance way of thinking,
Yeah,
right? This
cat
is like,
lady, childless cat ladies, blah, blah, blah. And the
yeah.
whole pro-natalist people and so forth. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that as a 73-year-old who was there through all these processes and saw them, um, what's interesting to me is to compare the hubristic claims of all commentators and futurologists, whether it's the population bomb or anything else, at certain points, this is how the future was going to be, and it never was. What
Hmm.
nobody predicted was the total bust that all of it became. So, nobody predicted that 10-year-old boys are getting their sex instruction from violent videos on YouPorn. Nobody predicted that the downside of feminism was going to be a kind of a cultural war carried on against women by angry men. I think your book is brilliant in that the Mike Douglas films sort of show the unforeseen consequences.
Mm.
And I'm so interested in your take on these without the labels.
Yeah. So I guess I would say if you look at kind of where we are right now, in the sense of how people are doing and how they're managing disappointment, because a lot of people are disappointed, right? A lot of people wanted more children than they are able to have. A lot of people wanted more romantic stability than they're able to have. But as far as adaptation to disappointment, women do a lot better than men. And I
Yeah,
think that men have gotten so stuck in grievance culture, in the manosphere, in the influencers
sure.
telling them you don't need to meet their expectations. You
Yeah,
don't need to treat them as human beings. You need to treat them as animals, as trash, because that's
yeah,
what they are. Like you're the beast and she's the baby
yeah,
deer, and
yeah.
your job is to annihilate her. And so I think that negativity primarily comes from men's culture. And I think that ultimately, if this sort of species wants to get going again to
Yeah.
restart, then men need to really sort of come together and figure out why are we like this? Why are
Well,
we like
also
this?
ask themselves the question, why have the women got all these sort of groups they're parts of and they talk with people, and we sort of do this alone or just in an online, disconnected kind of a thing, which is a great theme you bring out of your book. Where were men going to get the information necessary to assist them through this process? The models did what models did men have to learn how to adapt to the changing times? Men were still being asked to continue to fulfill those roles within the lives of women, of husbands and fathers and lovers and sons. But the rules for what those roles might look like or what behaviors were desirable versus problematic were in question. Their father's mode of masculinity was useless to them as a guide, but no new model was presenting itself, leaving men alone to try and navigate an uncertain time. And by the way, you write brilliantly. I just love your turn of phrase. I mean, you really nail it, but you do it so well. And thank you.
Thanks.
So talk about that because I think that's a big point.
Yeah, and I think that, someone was asking me the other day about online forums, because a lot of young men find themselves
Sure.
in, forums in order to commiserate about their experiences. And if you're sort of like looking in on those from the outside, they look really they look really bad, right?
Yeah.
Like that there's something about these online spaces, especially with young men who are not finding themselves attractive to women
Yeah.
or are
Yeah.
not being able to like meet sort of expectations sexually. Then you have these group of men like telling them, yeah, you should just kill yourself. Like it really is a kind of negative space of each
Yeah.
other
Horrible.
dragging each other down. And and that's what really worries me, is that people get addicted to these spaces where people tell them, yeah, you're not worth
Yeah.
dating. You're
Yeah.
not worth, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of have a different, my husband does jujitsu, and they have the closest friend group that I've ever seen in my life these guys who roll together a couple times a week. And I asked him, my husband, one time, like, what do you think it is that helps men in those spaces overcome the loneliness and the inability to connect that so many other men are complaining about? And
Yeah,
he's like,
yeah,
well, we roll around on the ground together for an hour a
yeah,
night. And had that guy's crotch in my face. Had my nose in his
sure.
armpit. Like that builds a bond. And I think that real life experiences and rolling around together might actually be the solution to a lot of
Well,
problems.
you talk at one point in your book about the fact that that men talk as if somehow they're joining a military, but actually not joining. They're not actually serving. They want these experiences, whether it's, bodybuilding or whatever. I have something here, and I put Elon Musk next to it. There has always been a steady supply of extra women in the world ready to service the great man's needs: secretaries, sex workers, mistresses, service workers, students, the unmarriable, um, etc. And then a little further down, you put, because they are no longer wanted, the extra women are easily discarded. Give her a cash settlement and an NDA, or maybe dump her body in a river. And it's really not go if it's really not going very well. And there's no way to escape the fact that a lot of the online lack of real connection is enriching the kind of people who in their own lives seem to be very much what you just wrote about. And when you read about Elon Musk's relationship with women, who he impregnates and gets IVF so he can get super intelligent children or whatever, test them, kind of a eugenic thing, and then how he discards them. And then if they don't do what he says, he sues them and cuts them off. We have a level of bad male behavior now at the
Mm.
top of our structure, that it isn't that, rich men have not always sort of done kind of like this, but they never vaunted it as an achievement. And the shamelessness of our present period of history, you could say, well, thank God for the lack of hypocrisy. We're not pretending anymore. But, hypocrisy is sort of a compliment to virtue, although backhanded. We don't even pretend
Mm.
anymore. And these rich, very super wealthy people who float above all of us with their means and so forth, um, I can't think of one of them where you're looking at the relationship and saying, yeah, that would be something that you would want to achieve. So you don't address that directly in your book, but you kind of sniff around the edges of it with passages like that bring people to mind right away, like Jeff Bezos,
Yeah.
Elon Musk. How do you see that? I mean, what the very moment we're in right now just seems to me to be everything you're writing about is magnified, to the power of whatever.
Yeah, the Elon Musk phenomenon is really bizarre because it's like it, it, he's almost like a representative of this weird sort of zombie patriarchy moment that we're in. I kind of make the argument in the book that patriarchy is over and has been replaced with something worse, right?
Yeah.
And um,
And I love that line, by the way. It's a single line. I think it's brilliant. I underlined it. Patriarchy's over. Now it's been replaced by something worse. I mean, that's something I haven't seen written down by somebody before, and I think it's brilliant because you've just nailed it right there. So talk about that.
yeah, because I think, if we talk about Elon Musk, a patriarch would not behave the way that he behaves in
No,
the sense of, I mean, in any sense, they would not behave because the patriarch is supposed to offer stability and respectability. He's supposed to
yeah,
be a sort of beacon of goodness and
sure,
stewardship, right? And this is about um, creating a world for the sons to inherit and so on. But Elon Musk has this kind of like hysterical patriarchal, like the fact that he's like building a compound in Texas to house all of these women who
yeah,
he has impregnated, that he uses the family court to destabilize these women if they
yeah,
go against him, and that he's creating like these kind of pseudo eugenic experiments in order to make sure that his children are male. Like, this is patriarchy zombified. Like the sort of actual content of patriarchy is missing, and all that we have left are these very exaggerated forms of the symptoms or the sort of morbidity of patriarchy that's left. So he has like this obsession, right, with creating sons, but he's not interested in leaving a world behind for these
No.
sons, right? He is really sort of intent on destroying the world, draining it of resources, and hoarding all of it, everything for himself.
Mm.
He's not really even interested in raising his children, right? According to some of the women who are involved with him, he essentially like abandons his kids with care workers, with
Yeah.
underpaid care workers. The
Yeah.
mothers are not given access to these children. So it's again like a kind of morbid form of patriarchy or zombie form of patriarchy. It kind of looks like patriarchy if you squint, but it's only in a sort of like hysterical form.
Yeah, and the thing is, when I was reading your book, that came to mind. Just what you're saying rattled through my head. We're sort of channeling the same things here, and I was trying to think to myself, what's the precedent for this? And you have to go back to the fall of the Republic in Rome and the beginning of the Caesars to find comparable people. That's the only
Yeah.
place you will find them like this, and maybe the Saudi court, some of the princes. But for a notable historical example, you don't find anything in what we call Christendom or Western civilization. You find plenty of terrible people, Henry VIII, whomever you talk about, but you don't find this as a thing that then becomes accepted and
Hmm.
normalized. Once it's found out you were doing this, you'd be finished in any other era of what we would consider Western history. You can't get away with this shit. So if you're doing it, you have to hide it, but only in when the Republic basically became no more. And then, of course, the Medici in Florence in the 14th and 15th century basically were able to do the same thing, not holding official office, but being able to live, the kind of lives that I guess that would be comparable. But there's nothing like this in our recent history, and I don't think people understand how it's changed. You say this battle between two visions of womanhood, we're changing concept subjects here, became fodder for the politics and mass media. The political left championed the freedom of working women, liberated financially and sexually, ambitious and fearless. The political right idealized the traditional wife and mother, imbuing her with a kind of sainthood for the endless patience and ceaseless love. Each side claimed the other was trying to oppress their imaginary women. I like imaginary women. The right claimed the left was a bunch of baby haters who wanted to destroy the family and pervert the natural order of gender differentiation. The left claimed the right was a bunch of misogynist religious fundamentalists who wanted to trap women in domestic spaces, silent and laboring unpaid forever. So again, a wonderful piece of writing, but I think one of the deep threads of your book is sort of a history of our culture wars. You talk about Pat Robertson. I was on the 700 Club actually 7 times, and um, somebody will make something of that. And when I fled the evangelical community, um, it was at a time when Pat had actually asked me to be on his board, and I was all of like 23 years old. I mean, I was part of the craziness back in the 70s and 80s, um, following that thread, and now I'm at a very different place. But I think that one of the things that you talk about in your book, in a very even-handed and very measured way, is when I read passages like that, I mean this as a compliment, I wouldn't know whose side you were on.
Hmm.
You're a very accurate reporter of what I was there. I was a fly on the wall while these things happened. You're reporting on them as I remember them, but I wouldn't know whose point of view you're articulating. And I think you're terrific. I mean, that's very unusual in a book, any kind of book, but especially one that is on something, so kind of in the center of all our big fights here.
Yeah, I do take that as a compliment. Because I think that you had these kind of two, yes, imaginary women, the stay-at-home mother and the sort of working feminist. And in reality, most women were somewhere in
Of
between,
course.
right?
Yeah.
There were very few pure versions of either one.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a very small conservative town in a quite religious conservative family. And so I saw a lot of these things. They made a very big impression on me because Rush Limbaugh was on the radio every single day and
Be a
Pat
little more
Robertson was on my
specific about the
TV.
religious family. What are we talking about?
So my family, my nuclear family, was Methodist and pretty traditional Protestant,
Yeah,
Kansas, very conservative. But then there was a large segment of my extended family that got evangelical
sure.
and even became like some of them have become members of the Quiverful movement.
Yeah,
And so there was there it was basically a mix between those two influences, a very kind of conservative traditional form of
hmm,
Protestantism and then this kind of more extravagant version of evangelical Christianity. And my aunt used to steal me away to take me to religious revivals and high school stadiums or whatever to to try to influence me away from my boring Methodist church. So it was a very sort of strange atmosphere, but everybody in the family was quite political
yeah,
in the sense that their religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with their political
sure.
beliefs. And so on the TV, on the radio, constantly was this right wing, Rush Limbaugh, Pat Robertson, all of the others, Jimmy Swaggart,
Focus
whatever.
on the family.
Yeah. And on the radio, in the car, like it was just like a
Sure, it was
constant
there.
noise. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that left a big impression on me, because I kind of didn't believe in any of it. And it was really hard to kind of fight through it. But I didn't really have it took me a long time to
Yeah.
find sort of
Yeah.
voices to help me figure some of this stuff out.
I'm going to reintroduce you here and then we'll plow forward because I have so much of your book that we haven't gotten to yet. Jess is a critic and author and feminist, and she's written all sorts of wonderful things. Currently, we're talking about this book, which is an incredibly good book. If you haven't been listening to this up to this point, maybe you don't know that I'm an immense fan of this. Uh, what is Wrong with Men in Conversation with Frank Schaeffer? Please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack. It has to be said commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we want to make this part of our book club. It has to be read. It'll be our September offering. So it has to be read as our book club that we're now making this part of. So let me just jump into some other part of the book here that I want to talk about that I marked up. Um, as long, of course, as the woman could adequately perform femininity, if you can't conform to your gender standards, you can be pathologized. So gay women, ambitious women, women who cheated or drank or had any other stereotypical male behaviors found themselves at odds with the system. But men were in but men in a but men were in a gendered double bind. If they behaved and presented themselves as gender conforming men in family court, it was assumed they were bad or at least deficient caretakers. If they tried to present themselves as taking on a more feminine aspect, they made themselves look ridiculous to the authorities. You talk a lot about divorce in this book. Does that come from any personal experience? You talk about My Three Dads. I don't know what those books are about, but divorce is such a big theme. Now, it's not if you're going to write about Mike Douglas's movies, it's totally legitimate. So I'm not imagining anything. I'm just wondering if your personal experience leads you to have a sort of an insight, because everything you write about divorce is incredibly poignant and true sounding. I'm just curious about your own experiences with that.
Actually, no, my parents are still together.
Good.
So personally, I did not have any experience with it,
Well, who
but
were the three dads? My Three Dads. What was that book about?
oh, so My Three Dads is about sort of the burden slash gift of patriarchal inheritance, I guess,
Okay, yeah, sure.
of so my three sort of father figures
Yeah,
in my life, and one was my teacher, my actual literal teacher, when I was a child. Then there was John Brown, the Kansas abolitionist,
sure.
and then the other was Martin Luther because I grew up very Protestant. So no, I don't have any firsthand experience of divorce in my family, other than my younger sister went through kind of a
Sure.
nasty one. But I have seen a lot of divorces from the
Yeah,
sidelines, right? Friends, when I was younger, their parents were getting divorced, some divorces in the extended family or whatever. So I think maybe that's why I could see it a little better because I
yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
actually
Well, I was just curious because,
involved.
if I write about religion or something and then you find out how I was raised, you say, of course, and he's interested in this. It's a through line in your book, and I was curious about it. Um, you talk here about something that I found very interesting. One of the largest projects of second wave feminism was to give women the narrative structures and the intellectual framework with which to understand their own unhappiness in contemporary society, especially as it involved domestic life. This was um, this was the meaning behind the slogan, the personal is the political. And then in that context, you also talk about how exactly these sort of groups or this kind of support network was what was missing in male culture. You talked about your husband doing jujitsu and this sort of connection, and then my son was in the Marine Corps, found the same sort of thing in boot camp, um, et cetera, et cetera. But talk a little more about that theme. I mean, the difference between how men and women were able to process, forget what your point of view is here, whether it's good or bad. I'm not asking about that, but how men and women processed the advent of modern feminism from the late 60s through to the present differently and are still doing so. And how now we've wound up with this sort of war of the sexes to the
Mm,
point where you look at Korea and you ask people why they're not having babies. And a lot of them talk about the antipathy they have toward men who still want to have families but do absolutely nothing to
mm,
accommodate their careers, this kind of stuff. I mean, we all know kind of about this, but I think you set it up very well in the way women were able to handle the change. Forget whether it's good or bad or not, but they were able to handle the change, and men were not. And you don't portray men as deficient in this regard. You're just saying they didn't have the structures to do this.
mhm,
Almost like someone who doesn't have a family in which to process growing up,
mm,
and the kind of you know single mom child, the kind of studies that show this doesn't work out as well as people with about, well, you've kind of transposed that narrative into how we deal with these changes. And I think that's a brilliant aspect to your book. And I
mm.
want you to talk about it.
Yeah, so part of second wave feminism starting in the late 60s was this idea that, look, the institutions, the law, all of these sort of structures that help create and sustain a life are not built for us. And they are not going to in any without forcing them to. They're not going to adapt
Sure.
themselves to our presence. So we have to create systems of support for ourselves and for each other. And
Mm,
it was very dramatic, right? I think that we don't do enough to sort of look back to see the real structures that women and feminist groups and also, gay rights groups and also civil rights groups created in order to um, help themselves and each other in a world that was hostile to them,
sure.
right? So you women wanted better access to education, so they created scholarships, they created mentorships, they
Yeah.
created their own colleges and so on. And in the arts, women created their own publishing houses and galleries and all of these things in order to be able to adapt to the world and to ask the world to adapt to them.
Yeah.
Men expected the institutions to cater to them, right?
Hmm.
Men expect the institutions to work for them because they always have. They
Yeah.
built them, they created them. They are supposed to be their primary customer. They're supposed to be top of the hierarchy. So,
Mm.
what you see in this era is this beginning of a change where the institutions realize um, they don't have to prioritize men. And really, it's not even beneficial to them to
Right.
prioritize men at this point.
And then, of
And
course,
so,
just to interject something, when the institutions start going away, like people not going to churches anymore, um, then or clubs or these things that have been written about at length by other authors, then of course, in a weird way, the men suffered more because at the very time women were putting together new institutions to challenge the system,
mhm.
less and less people were going to the more established institutions anyway.
Exactly, because women still had these systems of support and they still had ways of communicating with each other, sharing
Yeah,
resources, and so on. And men have sort of dug their heels in. You know, I don't think that it's any surprise that the Trump administration is going after the universities in the way that they are, right?
sure.
They want white men to be prioritized. And there's this sense of like, we got to get the Middle Eastern studies groups out of the schools. We have to get the gender studies groups out of the schools. And what do they want to replace them with? They want to replace them with white men, of
Yeah,
course.
while also bringing in South African farmers who are
Oh
white.
God. Yeah.
I lived
Yeah.
in South Africa for a year when I made a couple of my bad movies out there for a Hollywood company. Um, Dad was no longer a hero, he was an oaf. The message was that the married man is an emasculated fool, the butt of all jokes, too pathetic to do what is necessary and flee the domestic prison. The wife and the family went from being one of the rewards and pleasures of patriarchy to something a strong man should avoid. So no wonder membership in men's rights organizations swelled in the 80s. Women had built a tremendous cost, I'm jumping here,
Mm.
cost and tremendous cost and effort systems to assist other women who had to flee marriages. There are still networks of shelters for women fleeing violent marriages, organizations to help rape victims, legal support, professional and volunteers who can assist women in creating and financial stability after family comes apart. For men, there are some angry forums one can visit, some angry books about the injustices of the justice system. There are any number of guns one can buy, because as much as men insisted they too are abused and victimized and sexually assaulted by their female partners, they were unable or unwilling to create the system of shelters, counselors, and aid that women did. So we were talking about that subject generally a moment ago, and I just thought I would dive into one of your specific quotes in the book.
Yeah. You know, I've worked with, as a volunteer, some various organizations for pregnant women needing abortions, for women experiencing violence in some
Mhm.
form or another. And you really see like the how strong those networks are and how everyone is so devoted to this cause and they understand what the stakes are and they are involved and they're willing to spend, you know, hours of their time each week, unpaid, stressed out, burned out, because they know that this is important work. And you
Mm.
just don't have that for men. You don't,
Yeah,
men aren't joining these organizations as volunteers to help women for the most part.
sure.
But they're also not creating this for each other.
For
And that's what I
themselves.
find kind of strange is a sort of lack of solidarity, even within men in their own sort of
Yeah,
demographic, because it seems like when men come together in an online forum, in
sure.
these sort of groups that they create, there's almost like a kind of hostility and a desire to bring each other down more than lift each other up, right?
Mm, mm.
And that's what I find so confusing about the state of.
And yet men are looking for what you're talking about because again, I happen to have written a New York Times bestseller called Keeping Faith, a Father-Son Story about Love in the United States Marine Corps that I wrote with my Marine son about 20 years ago, and we were on Oprah and all sorts of stuff. So the book had a big breakout. But what was interesting to me, I then spent a lot of time on Paris Island. I got to know the Commandant of the Marine Corps and all these other things. And I would ask him and my son and so forth and so on, what the impetus was for the Marine Corps always being oversubscribed while the Army and the Navy, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard were always undersubscribed. And that was basically, in one word, we offer brotherhood.
Mm,
You're not fighting the war for your country, you're fighting to protect the Marine next to you.
mm,
And when my son left the Marine Corps and went to the University of Chicago, it was interesting. He was laughing because he said, the first day there was an introduction. This is again many years ago now, 20 plus years ago, by some well-meaning dean who was explaining to them that none of the kids probably had ever been in a multiracial or multicultural situation, and that they had to learn to get on with people. And John said, I didn't say anything because he's not a smartass, he's a Marine. But he said, I just wanted to explain to them that, basically from boot camp forward, my best friend Riaz learned to speak English in boot camp,
mm.
because he had come in, and his drill instructor was a black man, and the people he fought with were from all cultures and backgrounds, and so basically that kind of brotherhood was a very male bonding thing, and was what most Marines value most about that experience. So men
Sure.
can do this, but maybe not outside of that context. I mean, what sort of thoughts does that spark with you, having just written this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because I think it was in the very early 70s, there was a group of men that decided to come together because they wanted to figure out what feminism was going to do to men, right? Like
Yeah,
they wanted to figure out what they could learn from what feminist speakers and writers were telling them
sure.
about gender, whatever. And so they were like, okay, we're in support of this. We want women to feel liberated
Yeah,
and not whatever. So let's figure it out. And it very quickly devolved into a women hating, we're the real victims,
yeah,
feminists have gone too far, they're crazy, how dare they, and all this kind of stuff. And it basically morphed into the men's rights
yeah.
groups
So it
that were so
lasted for about
prominent in
two
the
minutes
80s.
in an original form.
Yeah, yeah. So I feel the difficulty of creating um any sort of brotherhood or any sort of community that doesn't come with like some sort of like real intention behind it to do something differently, right? Because
Yeah,
it's so easy to fall into these old forms of competition rather than solidarity,
yeah,
to narcissism over community. And there does seem to be an impulse of like wanting to pull someone down to your level that you think is
yeah,
above you rather than to lift everybody up. Yeah.
yeah. And of course, but that is not what happens in the Marine Corps.
Mm.
I mean, so it's not that men are incapable of this, but
Right. Yeah.
but certainly outside of the context of the intention of doing something together that has a higher or noble purpose attached,
Hmm.
some sort of ideal, so basically you're calling for all the idealism, but with none of the goals that are set by organizations like the Marine Corps, or for that matter, an evangelical church calling on men to, be caring, loving people. It just seems that men don't do particularly well without any structure, whereas women are able to
Yeah.
band together and sort of make their own structure. Maybe that's a real difference in,
Yeah. And I think that also, women now have decades, if not centuries, of experience of building these things up
yeah, of
from
course.
basically nothing. And I think there's a hesitancy for men to communicate with women, to learn from them, because
Yeah,
there's a sense of like, if I associate myself with somebody lower on the hierarchy than me, then I
yeah.
risk sort of
Well,
slipping
and the
down.
thing is, a lot of men, and typical Americans in general anyway, have such an ignorance of history in the sense of, the women's stories. But if you study Beatrix Potter and you understand that in addition to being shunned as a woman author for a while that had to make her way, then her parents are forbidding her to marry. And then she's also becoming a world expert on mushrooms, but the British Scientific Society will not allow her to join or give papers, even though her illustrations are the most accurate there have ever been. And you see this story replicated again and again and again and again. And that has nothing to do with feminism. That's just the facts on the
Hmm.
page. So, unless you're aware of those stories and personalize them, as in saying, for instance, my wife Jeannie, who's a very brilliant, wonderful woman that we've been together for 55 years, when you make that story about her or my granddaughter Lucy or whoever it may be, then another part of your male I guess mind is animated in just that basic sense of injustice. So
Hmm.
why is it that the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is shunned by good society in Boston for years because a woman's running it? Um, this is built into the fabric of everything you're talking about, but that backstory is never present. It's as if these contemporary issues just landed from outer space and are nothing to do with us as whatever. Okay, at the heart of falling down, I want to jump into one of the stories you talk about the movies. Is an identity crisis. Masculinity defines itself through its accomplishments. You are what you do, stripped of his family, his job, his money. He loses sight of his self. It's what is often said about mass shooters today, whether adult or adolescent. They are losers, unable to achieve most of the standard trophies of masculinity: family, career, money. They are left with only one marker: violence. One through theme of your book that, again, I think is brilliant is that you talk about money a lot in
Hmm.
terms of measuring everything by money. And if you look at Falling Down, the beginning of his frustration is he's played this game, but it hasn't made him rich. And he's not got that, speaking of Elon Musk and these tech bros and so forth today. So talk a little bit about that theme that runs through your book, because money, divorce is a big subject, but so is money, the acquisition and the keeping of money as the measure of everything. Um, and that has kind of poisoned the experience of being a male in a society which is addicted to career validation, both men and women, above family, above art, above culture, above everything. It's always about the career. And the career is always about the money. And I think the Mike Douglas's movies really have that through line, whether it's Wall Street or any of these other things. Um, Talk about that, because that's a huge aspect of your book. And again, the book we're talking about is What is Wrong with Men, Patriarchy, The Crisis of Masculinity, and now, of course, Michael Douglas films explain everything. And it's by Jessa Crispin, and it's a brilliant book that I showed her earlier. That's how dog-eared mine is, because I found so much in it I wanted to talk about. So just talk about money, 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 all the way through.
Well, I mean, Michael Douglas movies are about money. There are very few movies that he did that are not in some way just fundamentally about money. Even the movies about marriage are about money, right?
Mhm.
So, it's such an integral part of masculinity. And during this era, of the 80s, you see vast economic changes happening,
Yeah,
both on sort of the small individual level, but also on a global level. You have
yeah,
deregulation, you have the removal of safety nets, social welfare programs. You have banking regulations that are being changed dramatically. You have the savings and loans crisis happening, and it fundamentally changes the financial world, but also it starts to destroy the middle class, right? It starts to
mm,
eat
mm,
American society from the center. And so masculinity obviously has always had this element of the provider. He's
sure.
the economic engine of a family. And looking back through history, whenever you have these moments where there are enormous shifts in how money operates,
Yeah,
you see a crisis in masculinity,
yeah,
right? You have when the beginning of the shift from sort of rural culture to urban culture, you have all of these wars start to happen because it's like we have all these young men, they don't have money. We don't have anything for them to do. What if we just send them to Germany to go
sure.
slaughter the Protestants, etc.? Um, and so it's just such a primal version, such a primal element of masculinity. And because the financial rules were changing so quickly and so fundamentally, it of course had to have an enormous impact on how men thought of
Mm.
themselves and how men could feel that they had achieved a level of success or a
Yeah,
level of security.
yeah,
Because past the 80s, we don't really have we don't really have a middle class anymore. We don't really have a sense of stability.
yeah.
Everybody is sort of living paycheck to paycheck. Everybody is living sort of, except for maybe the 1%, everyone feels like they're sort of teetering on the edge of a cliff. One bad medical experience, one job loss, one tragedy, and the whole thing can come crumbling down. So looking at it had to incorporate, and I have to say, like, I had to read like 3 books about the savings and loans crisis in order to understand it. And every time I would be like, okay, I got it. I got it. I understand what happened in the savings and loan crisis. And then I would get distracted by something and I'd be like, no, I lost it again. I'll
Yeah,
just
yeah.
start reading another book. But that part of it was not, it's not in my nature to be able to
Sure, no,
talk
I
about
understand.
financial regulation, but it was fun.
So I'm going to do a little pretend thing here. One of the most brilliant little short 2 sentences on page 192. Patriarchy is over. What we have now is worse. And then I go to page, let's see, 194. Where is that? Yeah, next page here. The men are told they will be rewarded with love, community, money, quality education, and meaningful work when they deserve it. But there are no visible markers, no metrics that will tell a man whether he's getting closer to his goal. So if I was running a speakers bureau these days and inviting people to speak at college, I would kind of make that the title of your talk. Patriarchy is over. What we have now is work. So give me a 5-minute thumbnail of what you would say.
Oh man, that look, we have a culture that is fundamentally anxious about materiality, about proving oneself financially, ambitiously, and so on. And there will always be another task that the world wants you
Mhm.
to complete in order to add $5 more to your account. And you
Yeah.
will be inundated with opportunities, most of which are absolute fantasies of
Mm.
passive income, of gig work, of put your, you have 5 minutes to take a nap today. You should be hustling. You should be working. You need to be making calls and all of this kind of stuff.
Not
And
to mention Bitcoin and all the
oh
bullshit.
my God, the Bitcoin stuff is just so tragic to me. But essentially, um, the reason why we all feel like we're in a precarious state is because it's advantageous to the powerful that we all feel like we're in a
Yeah, yeah,
precarious state,
yeah,
that we are not enriching ourselves. We are enriching 5 men, right? We are
yeah,
enriching Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Tim Cook, whoever else.
yeah.
Um, and the only way to fight against it is to not be persuaded into thinking that the visible markers of success, like a giant watch, the watches just keep getting bigger and bigger,
Yeah.
the suits just keep getting tighter and shinier, the cars just keep getting louder. This is all about indicating to the world, look at how much money I have,
Not
look
to
at how
mention that the
valuable I
Oval
am.
Office is now a Rococo monstrosity
Oh, I
gilded
know,
from
he's
the thing.
putting
It looks like a joke.
gold. I know, he's putting gold on everything. It's disgusting. Um, and the
It makes
only
the
way to
Saudis look like Quakers.
I mean, it makes the, pre-revolution French look like,
Yeah, exactly.
quite, yeah.
Anyway,
So,
speaking of,
the only way to fight against this is to find within yourself some capacity for interiority,
mhm,
to find some way of building within yourself the ability to reflect, the ability to find calm, and the ability to relate to yourself and to others. Because without that, you are absolutely vulnerable to these
Mm,
forces.
mm, mm.
The entire world is now oriented towards forcing you to make these other people wealthy and to confuse you into thinking that you making Elon Musk wealthier is somehow fulfilling.
Yeah.
And that to me is like the only way out of this
And
mess.
that's how it's worse.
Yes, that's how it's worse, is that patriarchy, for all of its problems, and it had problems, came with a sense of stability. It
Yeah.
came with a sense of like the world told you what it wanted from you and gave you somewhat of an opportunity to fulfill those expectations.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, what those expectations were wildly different based on if your father was an aristocrat or if you're, whatever your race, your religion, et cetera, et cetera. However, it was a predictable form of building a society for the most part, given
Yeah.
some weird times in between. But now there's just a sense of constant renegotiation. Like every day you have to wake up and am I a success or am I a failure?
Yeah.
What disappeared out of my bank account today that I wasn't expecting?
Mm.
I have health insurance, but I go to see a doctor, and for 6 months after, I get surprise bills from that visit because certain aspects of it were not covered by the insurance.
Yeah.
There's no predictability. Everyone is out to scam one another, and the only people who profit from these systems is a very small select group of men.
Yeah. A couple of hedge fund managers who bought the hospital 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a kind of a philosophical question that I think, given your background, that isn't specific to your book, but I'm just so interested in you as a human, one human to another. So forget this as a podcast for a minute. Let me just ask you this. Um, it seems to me, in kind of looking at the arc of my life and the rise of feminism and the fact that I came out of this patriarchal, but really that's the wrong description, this evangelical culture in which you had all the answers because the Bible's true and didn't say what you were supposed to believe, or at least what your mother told you you were supposed to believe.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that one of the things that has happened, that of course is part of your story, not in a direct sense, but without which you can't understand your story, is that the kind of patriarchal aspect of you're the provider and your success is measured by the money you're bringing in, the income. When women in huge numbers went into the American workforce, what they were really replicating is what was true of hunter-gatherer society before agriculture, where the women were responsible for half the food. The women all had careers because otherwise everybody starved to death,
Hmm.
and they weren't subservient to the men. Very good book, by the way, that I love and is a touchstone for me, um, is The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, about her years spent living in the Kalahari with the Sand people in the 1950s. It's a fantastic book. But what she found there was sort of an ideal society that you would be describing if you were from evangelical background. You'd say, well, if everybody became a Christian, this is how it would be. Well, they'd been doing it for 100,000 years before Jesus showed up.
Hmm.
So there was something natural about that, pre-agriculture, pre-industry, and so forth. So I think one of the conceits of modern feminism is that they somehow discovered something. Actually, it's a return to what had been lost when it comes to the role of women. And that's not brought up much. But in the modern context, where it apes this sort of competitiveness of the male struggle for economic power, I'm wondering if part of the confusion and reaction and so forth and so on is because in general this is an unsatisfying way of life. And I would put this in a very personal context. I'm 73. I've had my successes and my failures and so forth. But at this stage of my life, the only thing that I am interested in doing is in continuing to foster a deeper relationship with the people I love most, that I have built these relationships with, whether it's Jeannie, my best friend, and my wife, my children, my grandchildren, getting to know neighbors because my dog goes down the street and I talk with them. I think that when it comes to the manosphere, in a way, they are aping something that feminism did, and that is it is all about the money. and the
Mm.
respect you get from the money, not the respect you get from your neighbors because you pick up the poop on their lawn, even if it's another dog's, because this is your neighborhood. And
Yeah.
I just think that both parties, if you want to put it this way, have completely, in some ways, missed the boat. So I am all for the recognition that Isabella Stewart Gardner or Beatrix Potter were had to struggle against something, and that struggle continues. But I'm wondering if in the end it's all about career and a corner office, or whether in the end it's more about human relationships, and whether what we're really losing in this world of Elon Musk and Donald Trump is a vision of the human race itself that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas encountered in the Kalahari with the Sand People in the 1950s, where she found these very admirable ways of being, where everybody in the community helps with the childcare, not because they read a book, but because that was the way they survived. And the roles of women were not defined by feminists. They were defined by survival for 100,000 years in an arid desert where the women and the grandmothers knew where the tubers were buried, and that's why you were alive.
Mm.
So I just wonder if in you personally, I'm just talking to you, Jessa, here, not the author, um, as you go through your life at an earlier stage than I'm at here, whether you foresee that you might arrive at that place when you're my age, in the sense of saying, well, that was great. I wrote some books. I did all this shit. But in the end, maybe measure yourself by a standard that is prehistory.
Oh, I feel like like um I feel like I already am kind of there. I don't know that my um I've never been that interested in money.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, money has always come with compromises that I'm not willing
Sure,
to make.
sure.
So I've always kind of scraped by. And that has been replaced with a kind of stability, mostly because I got married, which is a little bit embarrassing, like as a feminist. And yet, I don't care because actually, it should be the fact that when you get married or when you enter into a relationship, that you increase the happiness of each other's lives, that you make
Sure.
your each other's lives more stable, more interesting, more lively in different ways. And that has definitely been true in my life. But I see, in the last maybe 20 years or so of American feminism, such a emphasis on not just career, but acquisition and consumption,
Sure.
right? Totally divorced from actual accomplishment, totally divorced from making a real contribution or participating in something larger than yourself, but just as in on an individual level, being able to buy whatever it is you want, eat whatever it is you want to eat, go wherever it is you want to go. And that is supposed to make women feel fulfilled, feel
Yeah.
happy. And that for me has never been the case. And I do look on that side of things with a kind of horror
Yeah.
because it's an empty path. And I think also that that is something that's like a sign that feminism has lost its content, lost its substance, lost its ability to make real change in the world, and is now just like kind of a self-help cult.
Yeah. And it's very much been consumed by the five guys we're making rich.
Mm.
I mean, what do you think the whole influencer
Absolutely.
thing? I look at I have a bunch of granddaughters and a grown daughter who's very much got a career and all that stuff. But I look at the influencers that are trying to shape whatever they are, and they're just selling them a bunch of shit.
Oh yeah.
I can't believe it. It's like, whatever it is, and I look at this with a horror in the same way that you do it, any kind of predatory behavior aimed at your family.
Mm.
And the fact, and of course, it's been complicated by all the technology and the phones we're carrying around, because now we're living with these people in an intimate way that previous generations never knew. So I just wondered, what your prediction would be, taking the logic of your book forward. What are men
Yeah.
supposed to do? But, what are women supposed to do in this commercialized context in which, vice has become a major corporate endeavor across the board, whether it's, online gambling
Oh
or
God.
Turns
Yeah.
out that weed is now 100 times stronger than it was in the 60s when I had a few puffs.
Yeah.
Wherever you touch it, it's the consumer culture and the money thing defining us. In that sense, I mean, I don't really mean this, so it's going to come off much stronger than I mean it. But just for the sake of the discussion, in a sense, feminism has disappeared and been replaced by a vast commercial culture which has subsumed it,
Yeah.
devoured it. I mean, these are not, you know, the corporate version. It boggles me what's happened.
Yeah. I would struggle to argue with that. I think the one thing that's interesting about this is that both women and men do this thing where they blame the other group
Sure.
for creating standards that their own community has created and is sort of sustaining mostly through social media, right?
Yeah.
Women blame men for these unrealistic beauty standards that they themselves have created with the Kardashians, with the
Sure.
plastic surgery industry, with the cosmetics, with the contouring, with the, all of the shapewear, all of this nonsense came from women, right?
Yeah.
Comes from women's culture and is distributed throughout women's culture. Men blame women for unrealistic standards for physicality, for height, for muscles and all that stuff. But that's all distributed through male influencers in the
Yeah. I
manosphere and
totally
social
agree.
media. And I find that kind of this baffling part of this experience is that if we just talk to each other a little bit more and got off of the phones, we would probably see that we are sort of engaging with destructive fantasies rather
Yeah.
than with real human people. And it's also funny, I got asked the other night in an interview, she's like, well, there's no real equivalent, female equivalent to Andrew Tate. I was like, are you Kim Kardashian? The
Yeah.
Kardashians are basically the same thing as the Tate brothers minus sex trafficking
Sure.
charges. But as far as like poisoning the gendered expectations and the lifestyle and, people's expectations for how a life is supposed to be lived, it is absolutely on par. They're putting the same pollution out into the culture. And so I think, feminism has become incapable of meeting this moment because it's too besotted with all of it.
It has been. Yeah. And the male thing is totally right. It's completely self-created. And so many men feel it. I call a friend of mine who comes and helps me with the garden sometimes, former Marine, is a fireman and he's a man. He looks the role and you would think, okay, this will be someone. Okay. After 5 years, and I'm someone that tends to get into good conversations with people, I get to know people pretty well. Um, We've had more discussions in my garden where he's got tears in his eyes telling me about his own life and something that's happening in it. I get all the information from him. The hunger that is there in this very, he's a fireman, he's a former Marine, he works 3 jobs, he has fantastic equipment. He comes in and does things in an hour that would take me a week to do in my yard and so forth. And yet, when you just get to know him and he starts trusting you, I'm like I could be his grandfather now
Mm.
because he wants somebody in his life, a man in his life that he can talk to who is not, and I'm telling him about my grandchildren and about what Jeannie's doing and the latest surgical thing she had done on her face to have some sun damage removed. And he's telling me about his daughter and she just had a baby and helping to clean the apartment up for the boyfriend. Very unmanly stuff. And it's a conversation that I could be having with any number of women friends of mine. It's a non gendered conversation. It's basically just where he lives, but 99% of the time he lives in his head with that.
Yeah.
And when I see his hunger, basically he'll text me and say, I'm going to be there. Are you at home? And I know exactly what he wants. He wants me to come out, takes his glove off, turns off all the machines, walks over and talks to me. And sometimes we'll be there for half an hour. And because I'm this guy he can talk to.
Mm.
And I find it incredibly touching.
Yeah. And that's the kind of danger zone that a lot of people get into because there are so many people who are willing to take advantage of somebody who doesn't have a figure like that to go to in their
Yeah,
real lives, right?
yeah.
Then that's when you have the influencer telling them, well, you would have somebody in your life like that if you weren't such a loser, if you
So
made more
yeah.
money, if you put on more, if you ate more protein. People are eating so much protein. It's
Well, and
really,
that's what their guys are hearing. And then on the converse side, women are on social media being told not to vaccinate their children by conspiracy theorists on
I
one.
know.
And men and women, by the way, share an equal culpability here because the conspiracism is across both
Oh, yeah.
sectors.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. I mean, just insane. My wife is on Facebook with some people she's known for years, and she literally just comes in shaking her head and said, well, there goes another one, all sorts of stuff to anti-vax sites. What has happened to her brain?
Yeah.
And she's very frustrated by that. And then conversely, the men are the same thing. And I'd say, aside from feminism being consumed by the commercial culture, the Kardashians, the whole bit you were talking about, all of which I completely agree with you, there's this kind of overarching theme that the trivialization of truth, but also the trivialization of all aspects of life, um, is stunning. And when you can break through that with someone, you're rewarded by real conversations, but it takes a while because nobody trusts anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard when, you know, so my parents still live in the town where I grew up, and it's a town of like 1,200 people.
Yeah,
And the last election, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, my parents did not vote for Donald Trump, but it's a very solidly red county, and pretty much
sure.
everyone that they know did. And there was a sense of, you know what, it's nobody's business, and it doesn't change our relationships who anybody
Hmm.
voted for.
Hmm.
But this election, it became very angry and very on the surface of every interaction was this kind of suspicion about who did you vote for, and
Sure.
why and how and so on. And there was a lot of hostility on both sides,
Yeah.
both from Harris voters who felt betrayed, and by more so even from Trump voters who are like, how dare you disagree with me? How dare
Yeah.
you not think that this is
Question
the
any of
greatest
this.
man? Yeah. And so, um, you know, my father's lived in that we moved there when I was 6 months old. So my father's lived there now for, over 40 years. And now there are people that he knows and has known that amount of time that he cannot talk to,
Yeah.
that will cross the street to get away from him,
Yeah.
or will only talk to him in a heated argument form. And that's just the way things are now. And so I think that kind of hostility and suspicion about each other carries through in so much of it. And, someone said, well, it's because we don't somebody said to me, it's because we don't know our neighbors. And it's like,
Hmm.
it's not that. My father knows his neighbors,
Yeah.
and his neighbor still wants to, kick his door in because my father did not vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah. I have a question for you in terms of just both male and female, both sexes in this question. It just seems to me that one of the things that has happened to women and to men, the Kardashians on one side, the bro culture on the other, phones, there's lots of reasons for this. And Jessica Twangy, or however you pronounce her last name, gets into it all with her studies of Generation Z, or the iGeners, as she calls them. That's not what I'm angling for here, but I wondered whether, um, you know, extrapolating from people not having children, not getting married, not connecting, not dating. And of course, those are generalities, but that trend in that generation, in the youngest generation, um, are we looking at a future in which basic love stories will be incomprehensible? Just love stories, in the sense
Yeah.
that, Shakespeare presumed you knew what love was. Shakespeare presumed maybe most of his people coming to a play Globe or in Queen Elizabeth's court or wherever it would be would have been in love or known someone who was, or they would understand unrequited love. There was a general baseline, in the same way that people were once able to use Bible verses within literature without making any reference to them.
Mm.
You could use a phrase like pressed down and running over, and people would know that that was a biblical allusion to plenty, blessing of God and so forth. Now you'd have to have a footnote because people are biblically illiterate. It just seems to me that the presumption that there's a baseline understanding in human existence that was shared across all cultures of, I may not have ever been in love, but I know that happens.
Hmm.
Uh, and I have been in love, by the way. I'm not speaking for myself, but and I wonder what your point of view on this is, because it seems that nothing extinguishes love faster than the sort of Kardashian facelift culture on one hand, and then on the other, what these tech bros are doing. I have no idea, what Elon Musk is up to, but then just this kind of consumption culture, the influencers, all the rest of it, seems to me like it's a bad time for love.
I think I think there's like a kind of riskiness inherent in love that people aren't willing to open up to, right? And I see this kind of substitution into um there's a way that people, especially young women, respond to the romantic happiness, whether performed or genuine, of a figure like Taylor Swift as if it were happening to them, right?
Yeah.
And to them, I think it's almost as satisfying as if it had been, because in that sense of watching it happen to somebody that you identify with and that you spend all of your time thinking about,
Mhm.
that's almost a more satisfying experience, because then you don't have to deal with the disappointments of love,
Well, one of the
of
things you
the,
bring
yeah,
up your book fits very well with that. And as you talk about these sort of experiences reserved for the educated elite who are wealthy,
yeah.
you can fall in love if you're wealthy, if you look great.
Yeah, yeah. Marriage rates are much higher for the people who have the most money, and the rates go down as you
Sure.
go down in salary. And also education plays a huge part of this. You're way more likely to get married if you have a college degree than if you're not.
Yeah.
And that's what worries me. Like that these basic experiences of life are being withheld from so many people.
Yeah.
And I sort of use that word, the being withheld, very specifically, because it's not, we're in an artificial state. Society is not supposed to function like this. And the only reason it does is because it's been managed to function like this in order to benefit the very few, right? We are not in a natural state of behavior, of emotion, of outlet, of creativity. Things are being withheld from us, like love, um, like interiority and the ability to reflect and enjoy our company and engage with art and all of these other things. Those experiences are being withheld for the rich, and the rest of us are sort of being left behind.
One phrase I need you to explain: speculative masculinity.
Sure.
I loved it. I loved it, by the way, but it's so great that I've just got to hear you talk about it.
So yeah, I was reading about crypto.
Yeah.
And crypto is essentially a speculative currency, right?
Sure.
That you're
Yeah.
making a bet that this is going to
Yeah.
turn into something real or not.
Yeah.
And to me, a lot of the kind of behaviors that have been normalized in young men, behaviors that in the past would be seen as like pathological and extreme, um, that is a kind of speculative bet that it's going to pay off, that
Yeah.
it's going to be
Somehow,
seen as
somewhere, hang
manly.
it, stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, hustle culture and gig work goes into that, but also like the kind of uh gym swole culture, like
Yeah.
that's not creating muscles for strength, for
No.
use. That's only for that's and it's really not even for women. It's not even to be attractive to women. It's to gain respect as a man to other men, right?
What is
That's why you
the
get swole.
what's the equivalent? Because we've gone to Kardashian and culture and so forth. How would you, could you talk about speculative femininity?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all of the sort of like the Botox and the filler and the sort of
Yeah.
immobilized face stuff, that to me is absolutely part of speculative femininity. That's like making a hard bet that having a shiny face that does not show emotion, that is incapable of showing emotion,
Yeah.
that is somehow going to lead to being rewarded for being feminine.
Well, and of course, there's a level of self-delusion on both fronts, and without casting aspersions on anybody, but when I look at some of these younger men who bulk up and do all this stuff, I've done some quote manly things in my life. I'm a good skier, I've done all this shit, and I build and I'm construct and so forth and so on. But I don't come from an era where you look at your body in a mirror
Yeah.
and I mean, in my day, quote unquote, in British boarding schools where I was as a boy, we never looked in mirrors. That was part of the whole thing. Some matron had to come up and say, "Have you brushed your hair today?" Nobody,
Mm.
and you see kids running across the soccer field now and they're like fixing themselves for the phone. Speculative femininity, same thing. I mean, does anybody on Madison Avenue walking down there, what a certain type of person who's in the same age demographic as my wife, who's now 74, does she honestly think that her puffy lips are making me think she's 20? I mean, so
Yeah.
I just want to throw out two words to you and just have you riff on it for a minute. And that is, we're in an age of, and here are the words, self-delusion. It's
Mm.
amazing to me.
Yeah. And I think that there is an element where we are in some ways expected to, not just pressured to, but expected to create a sort of fantasy about ourselves
Hmm.
that other people interact with. Other people interact with the fantasy, not with us.
Sure.
You can call it branding, you can call it like a sort of online avatar or whatever, but the more that is disconnected from the actual self, the more sort of successful it is in
Sure.
some way. And I think that a lot of that stuff with women, and to me, the really disturbing part of that is that a lot of the surgeries, a lot of the fillers, a lot of the things you're supposed to buy to like wrap your face in before you go to sleep and all that kind of stuff. The goal is essentially to make it look like nothing has ever happened to you, right?
Right.
To
Right.
have a completely smooth, shiny surface that is only reflects other people's expectations
Well, in
and
these
feelings
tabloid
about
pictures
you.
before and after, look at her 20 years ago and look what she looks like now.
I
All right.
know, like
She
Demi
got
Moore looks like
older.
she nothing has ever happened to
Yeah,
her,
well,
right?
and a weird little thing that Mike White, who made these things for HBO, The White Lotus, who I knew when he was a child, and just fast forward, he casts a British actress who has sort of buck teeth, and all of a sudden this
Mm.
becomes an issue. Like, what's wrong with her mouth? I'm the Kirsten Dunst fan, and one of the reasons why Melancholia and all these movies are real and wonderful. She's a great actress, but she's chosen to keep her mouth human.
Yeah.
And I look at all these people in so-called historical drama with perfect
Yes, the
white
veneers.
turkey teeth. It's like, what the fuck? I mean, nobody's ever in history looked like this. And do you think that, a Norse swordsman went into battle with these straight white piano keys in his mouth? I mean, what the fuck is wrong with you people?
I
Like,
know, I know. It's so hideous too.
it's
It's like I don't
horrible. And
know.
they look so stupid.
It looks so stupid. But again, it's like it's about making it look like you've never eaten anything. You've never had a cup of coffee. You've never done any drinking, a glass of wine or anything. Just this beautiful blank slate that will nothing will ever happen to, and then you'll be dead and your body won't decompose properly because it's full of plastic, right? Like
Yeah.
it's so deranged to
It
me.
is deranged. And basically it's like any one of these things alone, you'd say, oh, so what? But when you add it all together, the sort of level of visual falsehood we all
Mm,
swim through, just walking, looking at movies. Every actor has the same mouth now. All the women with puffy lips, all the guys are supposed to be looking like I don't know what.
yeah.
Um, when you add it all up, it's very disconcerting, and it is shocking to the sensibilities of an old guy like me who basically looks around and says, my big question is, what does all this add up to in terms of what is this visual evidence of? It's evidence of something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite filmmakers is Paolo Sorrentino, the Italian
Yeah,
director. And
sure.
one of the reasons I love him so much is just he is very interested in people's faces
Yeah,
and not faces that are, managed and blank and shiny and
Yeah,
flat, but real people's faces. And there's
yeah,
such a humanity in just taking a camera and pointing it at somebody's face with love and curiosity,
sure.
right? And so much filmmaking today is really abhorrent to me because it's about these flat surfaces, just kind of moving them around like they were dolls. And the humanity, the that part of art that is supposed to be about a celebration of people and what they do and how
Yeah,
what they can create, like that part has been really lost in a lot of the sort of, the Marvel universe and the Netflix streaming stuff that you're just
yeah.
supposed to watch for 10 hours a day and not have any thoughts and, all of that stuff. So, yeah, I miss people's faces. I miss janky teeth. I miss a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm from the countryside, so I do not have great teeth, but I miss seeing that in people's faces.
Well, and when you look at Sorrentino's movies, or you look at Paolo Pasolini, or you look at Federico Fellini, or any of these people, they gloried in the human diversity of actual different looking faces and people and classes. That's how they filled their movies with interesting people. And now, of course, we've even got the technology that should you, God forbid, show up with a crooked tooth, they can fix it for you
Yeah.
in post.
Yeah.
Anyway, you and me are joined at the hip. I share your point of view. I love your book. At some
Thank
point,
you.
this podcast must end, so I'm just going to plug it one more time. What is wrong with men? Patriarchy, the crisis of masculinity, and how, of course, Michael Douglas films explain everything. Much as that sounds facetious, it isn't. This is a very serious book, and it's a fantastic read. If you've ever watched a Mike Douglas film, you're going to love this. I really love the way your take of his films, and I love how you use this as a vehicle for a much larger and very important message that maybe anybody who's been listening to us here will understand is in your book. It's a profoundly human document, and I just thank you for writing it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, me too. You're great. And listen, do me a favor here. I'm going to sign off because all things must end at some point. But stick around and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, for a minute because we're always looking for new guests and we want recommendations from you. We also want to make sure that we plug in properly to everything you're doing when we do your book club book that we're going to be offering, and any other thoughts you might have. And make sure we have your contact information and everything else because you're someone I'd like to keep tracking with. And anytime you want to talk about anything that is of interest to you, I'm being serious, just call Ernie and say, can I be on next week with Frank? Because I want to talk about such and such. It could be something you're writing, something that interests you, because I am so interested in what you think.
Thank you. That's very kind. I'll
Yeah,
take you up
invite
on it.
yourself back anytime. I'm being very serious. I hope
Yeah, I will.
5 times a year at least. This has been a great conversation. So much love to you and much love to your book and every success with your book. And just fantastic. It's a wonderful book.